Good morning, Brit Lit. Okay, so this is the explanation of Jane Eyre chapters 18 through 20. So these are the questions that you submitted Thursday night by midnight, hopefully. Remember that even if you're having to work on your phone and you don't have access to a computer, you can still upload these documents. All you got to do is go to the email that I sent or go to the portal, download the document. I have sent you all of these, just like this one, like you see here, where it's already broken out, like by the chapters and when it's due. Just download those to your phone, save them to your phone, and then you can open them in Pages or Notes or like whatever you have on your phone that works. If you're on an iPhone, Pages is the easiest. And then after you've typed in your responses, like if you're in Pages, then you click export and you can export it to a Word document. Then you just upload that Word document right to turn it in from your browser. So all of that can be done on your phone, okay? I need y'all to get with the program here and figure out the technology for us to use during this distance learning. Okay, so we are picking up with chapter 18. This is right after she had her first sort of introduction to all of the house guests at the end of chapter 17, and Rochester came out and said he wanted her to, make sure she comes every night into the drawing room after dinner, and so she does. So she said that if nothing else, at least it was very active with all the people there. There was lots of excitement, lots of bustling around. Normally in that huge house, it was just her and Mrs. Fairfax and Adele and Sophie and some of the servants. But now the house is full. So it's a lot of bustle, a lot of movement, a lot of interesting stuff. So one night they decide that they're going to play charades. And if you don't know what charades is, you can Google that. But basically, it's a game where you're acting something out and somebody's trying to guess. Like it's usually title of a book or a movie or a place or something like that. And so they decided to play charades, and Jane didn't play. Rochester asked her if she wanted to, but Blanche said she looked too stupid to play. So Jane was sitting it out. And so she watches them perform these like little skits. So in the first one, it looks like Rochester and Blanche are getting married. And so the crowd who's watching guesses bride, and that was correct. In the second one, they're doing a little scene from the Bible with Rochester sitting next to the well. And for, basically about the part with Rebecca that's in Genesis. And they couldn't guess that one, so they asked for the tableau of the whole, which is like the full scene, and then you see Rochester dressed like he's a prisoner, and then they guessed Bridewell, because Bridewell was a very famous prison in England. Okay, and so then they come out, and Rochester's kind of teasing Blanche, like, don't forget we're married now, all this kind of nonsense. And so Jane tells us shortly after that, she said, I've told you, reader, that I had learnt to love Mr. Rochester. I could not unlove him now, merely because I found that he had ceased to notice me. And so that's where she goes into the part about that this first question is asking right here. What does Jane come to realize about Rochester and Blanche? She comes to realize that even though they're going to get married, neither one of them loves the other one. She can see how Rochester just kind of coolly observes Blanche, and Blanche is like throwing herself at him and flirting up a storm, but neither one of them seems to truly care about the other one. And she realizes that if Jane were in Blanche's place, she would do a much better job of being able to win Mr. Rochester's heart, because she's gotten to know him really well and knows what he likes and dislikes. But she realizes that's not what they're after, and she thinks, well, I guess that's what the upper class is like. And she's right. At that time period, it really was, in the Victorian time period. Like, marriages were more like a merger, like in today's time where companies join together as a merger to combine their wealth. That's really what marriages in the upper class was. It was more about marrying someone who would increase your land or money or social status or something like that. It was rarely about love in the Victorian age. And so she realizes that that's what's going to happen. And she's kind of sad about that. She's like, if Blanche was like this wonderful, beautiful, kind woman, then, I'd be jealous, but I'd get over it and I would admire her. But she's not. She's mean. She's very frivolous, hateful. I mean, she's just not a nice person. Very conceited, very aware of herself and all of that. So, at any rate, she continues to watch from afar, and she says before the next part there, at one point, I was growing very lenient to my master. I was forgetting all of his faults, for which I once kept a sharp lookout. So probably because she's not really having as much interaction with him. She's just observing him from afar and thinking about how much she loves him. So one day Mr. Rochester was gone. He had to go and take care of some business in town. And so the whole company was kind of bored without him there. And then a visitor shows up. And at first they thought it was Rochester arriving, but this person was arriving in a carriage. And that's not what Rochester had left in. And so the visitor comes in and says that Rochester is an old friend, and that, even though he's not at home, he feels like he could, hopefully stay there and sort of shelter there and wait on Rochester to actually come back from where he was. And so, let's see, I'm trying to find a particular part here. Okay, so yeah, there's the next part, which is, what is his name? Mr. Mason is how he's described, Richard Mason. And he has a little bit of an accent, and Jane finds out that he has come from, around Jamaica, Kingston, Spanish Town, so basically the Caribbean. And Jane describes him as being he is good looking, he's handsome, but he looks almost like kind of vacant a little bit, and so even though some of the other ladies are really intrigued by him, she's not as impressed. And so then later on that evening, a fortune teller arrives, because earlier that day they had planned to go see a gypsy camp where there were supposed to be some fortune tellers and stuff like that, but it was rainy, so they didn't get to go. So that evening, this old lady who is a gypsy shows up and says she wants to tell the fortunes of the young ladies. And so at first, some of the older people are like, oh, I don't know if we should let her in, but the younger folks are like, no, this will be fun. It's been a boring day. This will be something exciting. And so they wind up putting the fortune teller into a little side room, and Blanche demands to go first. But whenever she comes out, and that's this part right here, what seems to be the result of the gypsy fortune teller's remarks to Blanche, let's see, whenever she comes out, she says, yes, this is not a genuine witch. She's just a gypsy vagabond, told me what people usually tell. She says, Mr. Ashton, you can probably just put the hag in stocks tomorrow morning. And then it says, Miss Ingram took a book, leant back in her chair, and declined further conversation. But Jane watched her for nearly half an hour, and during all that time she never turned a page. So, and her features grew darker and darker. So, obviously, whatever the fortune teller told her did not sit well with her. And then we find out later exactly what that was. Okay? So, then after that, the other young ladies go in all together, and they're all giggling and laughing and come out and say, oh, she's real, she knew all this stuff about us, and blah, blah, blah. And so then Sam comes up, he's a footman, and he comes up and says, the gypsy says that she wants to see you. She says there's another young lady, and you're the only other young lady. And so he's like, you don't have to go if you don't want to, though, or I'll wait outside. She's like, no, I'll be fine, because she was excited, too. She was like, I want to see what this lady's actually about. So she goes into the library, and the gypsy is seated over by the chair, reading in some little book. She's got like a red cloak on and a black bonnet that's tied down with a striped handkerchief under her chin. So she's kind of very covered up, right? And so she is just sort of sitting there reading, and Jane goes over and warms her hands in front of the fire because she can't get near the fireplace in the drawing room where she's normally sitting in that window seat, and she was cold. So finally the gypsy lady says, do you want your fortune told? And she says, I don't care, you can do whatever you want to. I don't have any faith. And so then they kind of go this back and forth, So the gypsy, Jane is interested, but she's not really believing it. So did Jane believe the gypsy was truly going to be able to tell her fortune? No, she doesn't. And does she hold her own against the gypsy woman's questioning? Yes, she does, because she, basically everything she asks her, she comes back with a quick answer. But the gypsy tells her, I'll tell you your fortune in a few words. You're cold because you're alone. No contact strikes the fire from you that is in you. You're sick because the best of feelings, the highest and sweetest given to man, keeps far away from you. And you're silly because, suffer as you may, you will not beckon it to approach, nor will you stir one step to meet it where it awaits you. And so then Jane's like, you could have said that to anybody. That's not specific. I don't think you know what you're talking about. And so then she goes on and the gypsy lady starts talking about Grace Poole and says that she knows her. And Jane's like, I'm glad I kept on my guard. And then she starts talking about Mr. Rochester and how he and Blanche look like they're going to get married. And Jane's like, I didn't come here to hear Rochester's fortune. Like, you're supposed to be telling my fortune. And so finally the gypsy says, all right, well, I'll try to read your palm. And Jane gives her hands, and she's like, nah, I can't read your palm. I need you to actually, kneel before the fire. I'm going to look at your face and tell your fortune from your face. And Jane's like, all right, I might actually start to believe you now. Because remember, we've talked about this before. They believed in a concept of physiognomy where you could actually tell what a person's character was like based on their facial features. And so while she's talking with Jane and trying to get Jane to admit to what secret hope she has. Do you remember what that was? The only secret hope Jane admits to is to one day owning her own school, being able to save up enough money to one day owning and running her own little school, basically kind of like being her own boss and not having to work for somebody else. So as the gypsy is speaking and kind of just talking and talking and talking more and more, and Jane starts to kind of be woven into this spell almost. And so eventually she realizes that she knows the voice. It doesn't sound like the voice of an old lady anymore. And the voice ends by saying, rise, Miss Eyre, leave me. The play is played out. And she's like, wait, what? And she looks and realizes, obviously, it's Rochester. And she's like, what on earth? And so he gets out of his, trappings that he had on and his disguise. And she's like, what were you doing? And he was like, oh, just, having a little bit of fun. Do you forgive me? And she's like, I don't know. Let me think if I said anything bad. And she thinks back, did I admit that I liked him? But she realizes she doesn't. She didn't say anything. And so she's like, okay, I guess I forgive you. But, why are you doing this? And so then he says, well, just sit down and tell me what the people in the drawing room are doing. And she says, oh, they're just discussing the gypsy, blah, blah, blah. And then she tells them, didn't answer that second part. Why do you think that person took this disguise? So I was just asking for your opinion there about why you think Rochester might have disguised himself as a gypsy. Like, what was his purpose in that? And so whatever you think is fine there. And so then, as she's telling him about how the people reacted to this gypsy, she says, oh, by the way, there's a visitor here. And he's like, what? I wasn't expecting a visitor. And she's like, yeah, he said he's a close friend and he could stay till you came back. And he's like, what? Who is he? And she says, his name is Mr. Mason, and I think he's from the West Indies. And Rochester acts so strangely whenever she says that. He looks almost like he's going to faint, practically. Like, he just keeps saying, Mason, the West Indies. And he looks like he's about to faint. He gets very white. And she's like, are you ill? And he says, I've got to blow. And he staggers, like he almost falls. So, obviously, hearing that name, for some reason, has just really shocked him, And so she says, lean on me, and takes him over to a chair. And she's like, what can I do? And he's like, oh, I need a minute. And he asks her to go get him a glass of wine from the dining room and to see what everybody's doing. So she goes in there, and of course Blanche looks at her like, what is she doing getting wine? That's not appropriate. But she sees that Mr. Mason is over by the fire chatting with some of the guests, and, everything looks fine. So she comes back and gives Rochester the wine, and he drinks it. And he said, what are they doing? And she said, they're just laughing and talking. And he said, they don't look grave and mysterious like they heard something strange. And she's like, no, they're all just, talking. And so he said, what if all those people came in here and spat at me? What would you do? And she said, well, I'd try to turn them out of the room. And he says, what if they all, basically shunned me and left? Would you go with them? And she's like, no. Why would I go with them? I don't even like these people. And so he said, you would stay with me? And she says, yes, you're my friend, and you deserve my adherence. And so he says, okay, we'll go back to that room and go up to Mason and whisper in his ear that Rochester is back and wants to see him, and then show him in here and leave me. So she does, and goes up to her room to go to bed because it's pretty late. But then she can't go to sleep because she's still wondering, what's going on? Is Mr. Rochester okay? But then eventually, late that night, she hears Rochester say, this way, Mason, here's your room. And he sounds really cheerful and everything. So she's like, okay, everything's fine. So she goes to sleep. So that leads us into chapter 20. And in the middle of the night, the moon wakes Jane up at first because it's so bright. But as she's going to close her curtains, she suddenly hears this scream. Just savage. It seems to fill all of Thornfield Hall. And then after that, it sounds like it's right above her room. She hears a struggle, and then a voice shouting, help, help, help. And then, will no one come? Rochester, Rochester, for God's sake, come. And so that's right up above her. And so then she hears people start coming and running out of their rooms. Where did it come? It's right up above her. And then she hears people running out of their rooms and all of that. And what's going on? Or, what's happening? Somebody find a light. And everybody's kind of crowding around. And Colonel Dent said, where's Rochester? I can't find him in his bed. And so then Rochester comes out of a door from the end of the gallery that leads up to the attics and was like, oh, it's fine. It was just a servant having a nightmare, and it's no big deal. But y'all need to go on back to bed because I can't get her quieted down while y'all are all up and roaming around. So everybody just needs to go back to their own room, lead the example, and go back to sleep. Everything's fine. It's just somebody screaming from a nightmare. So Jane realizes that all the other people apparently heard the scream, but didn't hear the rest of it, about somebody saying, help, 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 and Rochester, please come, because that was in the room right above her. So that's why she heard it and other people didn't. They only heard the scream. So everybody goes back to bed, but Jane's like, something weird's going on. Rochester had told her earlier that night that if he needed help, he would seek it from her. So she gets dressed, I feel like I might be needed. And she sits there for so long that she's like, well, maybe not. She's thinking about going back to bed when all of a sudden she hears a knock at the door, and it's Rochester. So that was a few hours later he comes to get her. And so he is taking her through the gallery, but then he's like, wait, do you have a sponge in your room or any salts? And so a sponge, just like a sponge, like those puffs that you would bathe with or something. And then the salts are smelling salts. Some of you football players may know what that's about. You get your clock wrong and they break them underneath your nose. It's like ammonia. That's smelling salts. And most ladies had them back in that time period because ladies were known to faint all the time, mainly because they were wearing corsets too tight and they couldn't breathe. And so a lot of ladies would keep smelling salts. And so she's like, yeah, I've got all that. And he says, okay, go back and get it. And so then they're about to go into this room up on the third story, and he said, wait a second, do you turn sick at the sight of blood? And she's like, I don't think so. I never have had an opportunity to see a bunch of blood. I don't know. And so he holds her hand, and her fingers are warm, and she feels steady. So he's like, okay, I don't need you fainting. So they go into this inner apartment, and she hears the ha 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 from Grace Poole. And she's like, oh, God, that crazy lady's in there. But then when she goes around to the other side of the bed, there's Mr. Mason lying there. And he's got one arm, and the shirt of that arm almost entirely soaked in blood. And so Rochester puts the smelling salts to his nose, so he wakes up and groans. And then there's blood trickling down from his arm and his shoulder. And Rochester's like, okay, here's what I need you to do. Y'all can't talk to each other at all. Like, Richard, you don't speak to her. Jane, you don't speak to him. But he tells Jane to keep sponging the blood away, and to, anytime Mason passes out, to snap the smelling salts under his nose so that he'll wake back up. And he's going to leave and go get a surgeon. So that's what he leaves her to do. Now, of course, we know that's exactly the wrong thing to do. If something's bleeding like that, you need to put direct pressure on it and, try to stop the bleeding, not just sponge it away. But they didn't know a whole lot about medicine in that time. So that's the next part. He forbid to talk to each other, Jane and Mr. Mason. Do we know not why? No, we don't. He just says don't talk to each other. He doesn't tell them why. And so then I asked you to kind of make a prediction. So you could have written whatever you think was the reason why he didn't want them to talk to each other. So it's hours that Jane's sitting there like sponging this blood, can't talk to this guy. She's scared she's scared he's going to die right there in front of her, and she can't even say anything to him. And it's just really creepy. The candle burns out, so it's dark. It's almost dawn, so it's starting to get a little bit light outside, but in any minute she's scared Grace Poole's going to come roaring out of that little chamber that's a doorway leads to from in that bedroom. And it's just a terrifying night. She said that it was only a couple hours, but it seemed like weeks that she sat there sponging his blood. So anyway, eventually Rochester returns with the surgeon, and whenever he does that, he tells the surgeon, Carter, to, be alert, and he says, I'll give you half an hour to dress the wound and get the bandages together, and then we got to get him out of here. And he says, is he fit to move? He's like, yep, he's going to be fine. Get to work. So Rochester seems a lot more interested in getting Mr. Mason out of the house than he does really concerned about his wounds and everything. And so he asks Mr. Mason, how are you? And he says, oh, she's done for me, I fear. And he's like, no, courage. This day, fortnight, you'll be just fine. So in other words, in 2 weeks, you'll be fine. You've just lost a little blood. And so Carter has undone the bandages and is looking, and he says, I wish I'd got here sooner. He wouldn't have bled so much. See, I told you they should have put pressure on the wound. But he says, but look, the flesh on his shoulder is torn. This wound wasn't done with a knife. There must have been teeth here. And Mr. Mason said, she bit me. She worried me like a tigress when Rochester got the knife from her. So the wounds were caused not only by a knife, but also by teeth. She had bitten him. So obviously Jane assumes he's talking about Grace Poole, because that's who's locked up in there doing that creepy laugh. And Rochester's like, you shouldn't have yielded. You should have grappled with her at once. And he's like, oh, it was terrible. She was quiet at first. And Rochester's like, I told you to be on your guard if you went near her, and I told you to wait till tomorrow when I could go too. That was dumb. And so he says, Carter, hurry up. But then Mr. Mason keeps talking, and he's like, she sucked the blood. She said she drained my heart. Which that's interesting, right? And so Mr. Rochester shudders and is like, never mind her gibberish. Be silent, Richard. And so eventually they get him all patched up. Rochester sends Jane down to go get some smelling salts. And with the smelling salts, not smelling salts, she already had those. He sends her down to get this little vial of liquid. And so this vial of liquid, he says he got, it's not truly considered medicine, but it's something that he got in his travels. He got it in Rome from an Italian charlatan. He says you shouldn't use it indiscriminately, but it's good upon occasion. So I'm not sure what it is, but it's a little vial, and he puts 12 drops of some crimson liquid and gives it to Mr. Mason, and that gets Mr. Mason, feeling better and able to get up and get downstairs and get in the coach. So it's kind of weird. So anyway, he finally gets the surgeon and Mr. Mason gone, and Jane is going to head back inside. And he's like, no, let's don't go back inside. The house is terrible. Walk around in the garden with me. And so that's this next part where he's like, let's walk around and see how everything's doing. And so he gives her a flower and says, you're very pale. Are you okay? And, I know that was a really strange night. And she's like, well, I was scared Grace Poole was going to come out. And he was like, no, I had locked the door. I would never, leave you in danger. The door was locked. And she didn't know that. And so she's like, well, is she still going to live here? And he's like, yes, she's still going to live here. Just don't worry about it. Jane's got to be thinking, okay, she tried to burn you alive in your bed. Now she's, tried to drink the blood of this Mr. Mason guy from the West Indies. Like, why are you keeping this lady here? So, very confusing, but he doesn't answer, exactly what it is. And so then she's like, why were you so scared of Mr. Mason? He seems like, he'd do anything you said. He seems kind of weak and whatever you tell him to do, he'll do. And he said, yeah, that's true, but he could accidentally destroy my life. And she's like, how? And he said, just by a careless word. So he doesn't really explain that. So she doesn't really know what he's talking about. And so as they're sitting there and talking, he starts doing like he's done before at some of their fireside chats and sort of really talking. Oh, and I'd asked, what do you think his feelings are towards her as they're in the garden? And so just whatever you think there. So then as they're sitting there talking, he's doing, again, admitting to an error but not a crime. And so the sentence says, to attain this end, are you justified in overleaping an obstacle of custom, a mere conventional impediment, which neither your conscience sanctifies nor your judgment approves? So basically, he's trying to get her to respond to something without actually telling her what he's talking about, which is very weird. And so she's trying to be very careful there in answering. And so she basically, once again, is saying you just need to turn to God, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, yes, but the instrument, God has angels here on earth. And she doesn't really know what he's talking about. And so then he suddenly changes, and he stares at her for a long time, and when she looks up at him, then his face kind of gets hard and cold, and he says, well, look, I'm going to marry Miss Ingram. She'll probably regenerate me. And she just kind of looks at him, and he's like, will you sit up with me the night before I'm married? I won't be able to sleep. You can sit up and talk with me, and I'll tell you all about how much I love Miss Ingram. And she's like, yeah, okay, whatever. And so then she goes inside and she hears other people coming out of the yard, Dent and Lynn heading to the stables. And he says, Mason got the start of you all this morning. He was gone before sunrise. And so that's his excuse for, Mason being gone. So that is 18 through 20. Remember that you should have corrected your answers as we went over it. And then the next thing that's coming up is 21 through 23. So you're reading 21, 22, 23. And that needs to be submitted by midnight on Monday. Okay? So you have the weekend. You got today. You got the weekend. And you've got all of Monday to work. That's due by Monday night at midnight. Okay? Y'all have a great weekend.